Hello everybody, welcome back. Before we get started with this week's episode, there is a bug that's been prevalent in the latest versions of GameMaker that I need to warn you all about, and you may have already been affected by if you've been following my tutorials to the letter. I've been affected by it just by setting up this series, and that involves some of you may have noticed rooms disappearing from your game, and you haven't. And even if you go to rooms and like right click and add existing and try and sort of add them back, the .yy files back into your game, GameMaker doesn't seem to recognize them as valid files anymore, and it just loses rooms completely. And obviously that's a pretty big deal, so you got to wonder why that's happening. If this is happening to you, the reason is because you probably, like I did, had a signpost from our episode about like 3 episodes back with a text string in it that had one of these symbols in it, this /n. Okay, so you will have had something like I had before, which was "please don't murder anyone," /n for a line break, the park ranger, and that was our string before, right, for this signpost. The problem is, this variable stuff, it all works fine in the objects when you edit them, but in the room editor, when you are editing an instance, and this is unfortunate because it's the most useful version of this, when you include this /n in a string, it screws with the file that the room saves when you save your project. And because it's actually formatted in JSON, every room that gets saved out, okay, every .yy, like r_level1.yy gets saved out as like a JSON file. Problem is that /n I think also represents like a line break in JSON, so it screws with the file format because it literally puts this string in there, and then that screws with the formatting. With I think a past version of GameMaker, I think it's like the IDE just before this one, so just before 288. This would just mean GameMaker just it wouldn't save it properly, and you wouldn't even be able to bring that room back into GameMaker. So the next time you loaded your project, the room would just be gone because you'd included this string. Now I think that element of it has been fixed, but there is still an issue. If you do still use this, you'll find that when I save and reload this project with that in it, it'll come back looking like that. In the room editor, okay, so it'll like truncate the last half of your string, which will obviously screw with you if you then edit that. Truth is, the data is actually still correct when it comes back looking this way, and when you run the game, the text will still look fine, but you obviously don't want this screwing up in the IDE, because then when you start to change that, it'll then overwrite whatever was there, and that's obviously bad. So the quickest workaround to this is, instead of using this variable window to define specific text for a specific signpost, just use the creation code, and that's what I've done here, okay? So you click this window at the bottom with creation code, and just type text equals, and then the text that you want, okay? And that'll overwrite anything you defined in the variable window for a start, so it doesn't matter that this is still here. And it'll still work just the same as setting a thing up in this window, okay? It happens after the create event, so your create event happens, and then a specific instance creation code happens, so this will overwrite anything you defined in the create event as well, okay? That's a quick workaround to that. If you are going to use strings in the room editor, just make sure not to use this symbol for now. I have been told that this is fixed in the internal dev version that they've got going over at Yo-Yo at the moment, so when the next version of the IDE comes out, hopefully, if you check the patch notes for it when it comes out, we should be seeing a fix for this, most likely. Cool. Okay, sorry that's like the first 5 minutes of this video wasted, but it was pretty important to talk you guys through that. Alright, so we're up to part 19. Where do we want to go from here? I think, honestly, we've come a long way, and we've covered a lot of stuff. We have covered getting your player to move around, we've got like wielding a weapon if that's the kind of thing you want to do, we've got enemies, and sort of adding polish to sort of the interactions between firing the gun. We've got some signposts that display like text on the screen and how to do like cutscene type things. We've got cameras, we've got nice parallax backgrounds, we've got moving between different rooms, we've got a menu screen, a title screen, sound effects. We've got, hopefully I think at this point we've covered most of the bases, both in code, structure, and just general workflow of a GameMaker project. that you should be able to more or less go from here and start doing your own thing. Start working out what it is you want to make and start thinking about how you can approach that kind of thing. Obviously, we've not covered everything, but I think most of the stuff carrying on in this particular genre of game, we're going to be sort of treading over old ground in terms of the code we're actually using. But what we're going to do is, I still don't think this game is really finished, right? So we're going to move towards kind of filling in those gaps of the game's design and just sort of finishing off the project and kind of adding those finishing touches to make it feel like a complete thing. So if you are following along, we can end this project on something that we can say, yeah, this is our first complete start to finish game, and we can, you know, make sure we've covered really all of those bases. So what are we going to do today? Well, I'm going to do a couple of small things just to sort of set the groundwork for how we want to go on. As you've seen, I've already kind of redesigned this first level, and not just because of the bug that was killing some of my rooms in GameMaker, but because I was starting to think more about the design of this game, and because of the way our parallax works, obviously our game favors naturally very horizontal levels with a sort of minimal amount of like verticality, and like, so we don't want loads and loads of climbing, obviously, because then we start to lose the effect of kind of, you know, nice parallax backgrounds and that kind of thing. So I think we're designing a game that's kind of a bit Mario-like in that regard. It's kind of, you know, mostly focused around sort of a horizontal kind of progression. So I've kind of redesigned it around that kind of flow. And what I want to do is I want to introduce the gun mechanic to the player at the beginning of the game. I don't want to just try and drop you in and just be like, you've got a gun, go. I kind of want to add a bit more pacing to it than that. So what we're going to do with this first level is I'm actually going to take the gun away from the player, and we're going to put it on this little pedestal over here. And we're going to block the player's path with some crates. And the crates that they're going to have to destroy with the gun in order to actually proceed, okay? It's a good way to teach a mechanic. If you provide someone with a thing, they get a thing, and then they can't actually progress without using the new thing that they've acquired. You still have to be careful with this, but it's a good way generally of getting the player to learn a new mechanic. Okay, so that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna take the gun away from the player. We're gonna create it as a little pickup here. And we're going to create some crates that you can destroy in here. And then both of those mechanics are very reusable, and they're nice things to know sort of how to do in code as well. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is just pop onto the gun layer, select our gun, and delete it. You might want to run your game at this point, okay, just to make sure that everything still works without your gun. If you've just been coding everything how we've been coding everything, everything should be fine. So if I come into the game here, yep, I'm fine. I just don't have a gun anymore, and I can't shoot. I don't even have arms. I don't think I'm ever going to change that. I think it looks funny with him just running around with no arms when he doesn't have the gun. But everything else still works, you know. Which is lucky for us that we didn't make everything too dependent on the gun's existence. Depending on what you might have added yourself to the game, if you've added like a complex weapon system or anything else that's really tied into the gun, you might run into some issues where some objects you've got might expect the gun to exist when certain things happen, and you'll want to jump into that code and do something like an if gun exists kind of thing with the code to prevent that kind of bug, okay? We get away with it okay here, and you'll notice we do things sometimes like with gun and so on. One nice thing though, when you use the with function, so when you do with player or with gun, etc., if that instance doesn't, if there are no instances of that object, you don't actually get an error. It doesn't crash. It just does that code to nothing. I don't think it even runs the code. You can't quote me on how it exactly works internally. I think it just skips the code, but I think it'll just returns no one, the keyword no one or -4, with no instance of that object exists, and then the code just doesn't get applied to anything. So with is a very useful function in that regard, so you don't have to do like if exists every time to be really safe. Okay, so now we've got rid of that gun. What we're going to do is we're going to place a gun pickup here that we can just kind of collect. So I'm going to make a new object and call this, press F12 just to give us some space, and call this O gun pickup. I'm going to select a sprite that I made earlier, just called sgun1. I just decided I didn't want it to be like floating horizontally, exactly the same as like the gun is when we hold it. I'll just give it a nice little sort of different sprite. You can draw whatever you like for yours. Oops, I didn't mean to close the workspace. Right, so with this object, what we're going to do is add the step event, and what I'm going to do is make it float. I think that's just that's a very typical kind of pick-up-y thing to do, right? And I'm just going to write a really simple little chunk of code that will make an object just sort of float in space by typing y equals y start plus sin get timer open bracket close bracket divided by 50,000 500,000 even, sorry, multiplied by 5, and we can just describe this as float, I guess, here as well. So what does this do? We know what editing a y coordinate does, right? And that's just moving us on the vertical axis. Well, we're taking our initial y position, so wherever we stood, and we're going to add a certain value to it, and that value is going to move between -5 and -5, so 5 upwards, and +5, so 5 downwards over time. Get timer is a useful function. It returns the number of, I think it's microseconds that have passed. Okay, I might be wrong there. I always get my units wrong when it comes to seconds and time. That have passed since the game has started, okay? Obviously there's 1,000,000 of those in 1 second, so by dividing it by 1,000,000, you would get like you would get a full 1 from this every full second that passed, right? Whereas divided by 500,000, we're getting it about half that, so it's like going up to 1 like every half a second or something like that. Sine is a special mathematical function. If you remember from trigonometry classes, it's really useful. But all you really need to know is that it returns a value between 1 and -1 in a wave, okay? Depending on the value you put into it, between 0 and 2 pi, right? And the peak of the sine graph is obviously 1, and the bottom peak is -1. So it's really useful as a function just to get values that sort of wave back and forth between 1 and -1. By just putting in a value that increases over time. And this we've got get timer that can do that for us, okay? And by dividing by 500,000, that controls like sort of the time scale with which we want to do that. And then by multiplying the final result by 5, we're getting a final result that doesn't wave between 1 and -1, which would give us a tiny amount of float, but between 5 and -5, that just makes it a little bit bigger. So let's just pop that in the room. If I just pop into our level 1, we'll use the same gun layer. I think that's fine. It'll show up above the player, but that's okay, because when we collide with it, we're just going to pick it up. So I'm just going to run that, just so we can see that in action. Just a neat little floating thing. You can see there, it's just sort of bobbing up and down, okay? I might have to zoom in so you can see more clearly, but there we go. Cool. So the other thing we want to do with this is just make it so that when we collide this object with our player, we get the gun, right? So I'm going to add event collision with player, equip gun, can be the description for this, instance create layer oplayer.x, oplayer.y, on the gun layer, make sure that's in quotation marks, ogun. Okay, that's going to make an instance of ogun on the gun layer. We could have even just put layer in here really, but we want to make sure specifically it is on that in case we want to move the layer that this is on later. And then we just want to kill this object, so instance destroy. Really, really simple, and then that'll work. What would be cool if you're doing your own sound effects as well is to put in a sound here like a I suppose would have been cool. I didn't bother to do that myself. Maybe I'll come back and add that later. It would be quite good. But we pick up the gun, and then we've got the gun. Okay, simple stuff, it works. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use the fancy workspace shortcut Alt-O to create a new object this time. Whoa, look at that, created it right away, didn't have to click on anything. I'm going to type crate is going to be the name of this object. I'm going to set the sprite to be a sprite I made earlier, which is scrate. It's very simple, you can make whatever you want. Whatever you do make, though, make sure the collision mask stretches to fill the entire box of the sprite. That's going to be a little bit important later. And make sure your sprite supports that, so it can't be just a weird circle or something like that. It's got to be something that makes sense with a box shape, and you'll see why for this particular object as we go on. I'm not actually going to put any code in here right away. We're going to inherit all that code from another object. But I'm going to go ahead first of all and place some of these crates in the room editor. So I'm just going to come to the walls layer. I think that will make sense. That's what these are basically going to act as, just destructible walls. We're not going to give them any gravity either, so you might want to make them something that makes more sense than a crate, I suppose. You might want to make a rock or something like that. Crate was just the first thing that came to mind for me for this. So with those there, we'll go ahead and close that room editor now. And we're not, as I said, going to put anything into crate. Instead, I'm going to make another new object, pressing Alt-O, and I'm going to call this one pShootable. So what pShootable is going to do is it's going to act as a parent object for anything we have in our game that can be shot. The reason I'm doing it this way is because we've already done some cool things with our enemy, right? We've got this cool flash code going on, and we track our hit points and that kind of thing. And rather than having to duplicate that across all enemies in case we wanted to change how it behaves later, it makes more sense to just inherit code like this from a base parent object, okay? So what I'm going to do in enemy is I'm actually going to delete in our variable definitions, or from the create event if you're in 1.x, our hit points and flash variable, because we just don't actually need them in there anymore, or we won't anyway. And I'm going to copy this code from the draw event. In pShootable, I'm going to first of all define this object as being the parent of, by clicking this plus button next to children. Make sure you don't click parent up here instead. Make this the parent of enemy and crate. Okay, and then I'm going to add draw event and paste that chunk of code in. Okay, and if I come to our enemy now, what I can do is actually just delete this draw event. You see it hasn't actually gone away, it's just turned grey. Because we have got rid of the enemy's draw event, but it's now just inheriting that draw event straight from this object, okay? And we can't actually edit it in here, but we can edit it in here. Okay, just a reminder on how parent-child stuff works. And the same will be true, obviously, of our crate object. It'll have that in there as well. Our enemy has its own way of handling itself dying, where it says if hit points is less than or equal to 0, instance destroy. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to overwrite that event, but I am going to create a begin step in here. Oh, sorry, no, wrong object. I'm going to create a begin step in our pShootable object. Begin step that just says if HP less than or equal to 0, instance destroy, just so we have basic code there in case a child of shootable doesn't have anything fancy we want to have happen when this happens, okay? So you can see crate has inherited this code, and enemy has not, because enemy has its own begin step. We could write event inherited in here, or we could right click this and delete it just to get that inheritance back and all sorts of things if we wanted to, but we don't want to because we do our own thing with making our corpse and so on for the enemy that we don't want to overwrite, okay? So that's most of that setup, but what we want to do is go into our bullet, because as you remember, this currently has a collision event with just enemy. So what we want to do is change that to be a collision event with pShootable, and that will include all of its children. So that will include a collision with crate as well as enemy. The last thing, of course, we can't forget to do is come back to our pShootable object, go to variable definitions, and add back in that HP value. We'll set it as a default of 4. And we'll set flash as 0, and you'll notice that then appears as well. So if we go to enemy, again, you'll remember this probably from the parenting episode, but just to make sure, go to variable definitions, you'll see hit points is in there, and we can edit that to be different things if we want, and you'll see it's in crate as well now. there. So we can edit those if we want. That's fine too. You have to do this slightly differently if you're working in 1.x, but if you got through the parenting episode, you can get through this. So, so we could edit that. So let's edit that for a crate. Let's give crates 5 hit points instead, okay? Just so that we've made one of them a little bit different. Okay, once we've done that, we've got our crates in the room. If we run the game now, there should be more or less everything for us to run and pick up this gun. You can see our crates, and we can now shoot them. They don't disappear in a very exciting way. We should probably play some sounds and make them explode and stuff. We'll come back to making the explosions of these a bit more polished in a future episode. But obviously, there's still a problem here in that these don't actually block our path in any way. Now, there is something we should talk about how we've set this up, okay? Doing things like this, where we just add a parent in later on, is not exactly the best practice, okay? Not without a more thorough rethink and a more thorough replan and restructure. What you should generally try to do with parents and inheritance is plan these things out more ahead of time, okay? So we should know that, okay, our game's going to have a bunch of things that can be shot at. Maybe we'll want to make a base parent object for things that can be shot at, or a base object for our different enemy types or different walls, and that kind of thing, and do those things ahead of time, and then build your parent objects first, and then build everything else outwards from there with an understanding of what different things are actually going to be in your game, rather than adapting to what you later want in the game and going back and adding things to try and make this stuff work. That's not the best practice, and that can get your code tied in knots. We've done that in this instance, mostly because that's the nature of tutorials. We couldn't cover parent stuff too early on, it didn't make sense to. So we had to leave that a bit later, which meant we had to build this stuff in sort of simpler ways that didn't account for this kind of thing. That's just the nature of a tutorial series, okay? So what I'm just pointing out that what we've done here with P-Shootable is not the best practice, and we're about to see one of the reasons why. Because what we want to do is make crate collidable, right? We want to make it so you can walk through this. Now, the most obvious thing, solution for this would be to make this a child of O wall, right? This is basically, I mean, this could basically be called P wall at this point, right? We could make, because, I mean, it's an invisible object, we use it in the room, but fundamentally it's a good idea usually to have a parent object that is just your collidable things, and you can make children of all the things that can be collided with. But we've already made O crate a child of P shootable instead, so we can't do both, and that's obviously an issue. With much better planning, we could have planned behavior into O wall that could have made certain walls shootable and all that kind of thing, and certain walls not collidable, and structured this whole thing in a different way. But as I said, by the nature of how we built this tutorial and how we started off simple and gone gradually more complicated, it wasn't really possible to do that in the best of ways. I'm just pointing it out so that in future, when you are working on your own projects, you should know that you're going to run into weird issues like these if where you kind of have to do a little workaroundy type stuff and start to make your code a little bit messier if you don't plan out the structure of what you're going to build. Some of that's inevitable, you can't plan for everything, but you should try the best you can to try and think, okay, what types of objects am I going to need? What should they all kind of inherit from? What base objects am I going to need? And just think through the structure of your game project before you just dive in and just start making it all. Okay, it's a very good idea. With all that said, how are we going to solve this crate problem? So we can't just make this a child of O wall, but what we can do is create a copy of O wall for this particular crate. That's going to be our slightly workaround but fairly reasonable solution to this problem. So how are we going to do this? In the create event for O crate, what I'm going to do is, in the description, I'm going to call this create wall, and I'm going to say my wall equals instance create layer x y layer. I just put it on the same layer as this one, it doesn't matter, it's invisible, and we use the wall layer for these anyway. O wall. Okay, well, by doing that, we've created a wall object at the place where our crate is, and we've put its instance ID inside this instance, meaning we can destroy it later when the crate gets destroyed, okay? And that kind of thing. What else do we want to do in here? We want to affect this wall, because I notice our walls are actually differently sized to our crates. They're 32 by 32, our crates are 48 by 48. So what we're going to do is type with my wall, open and close brace, image x scale equals other dot sprite width divided by sprite width, and image y scale equals other dot sprite height divided by sprite height. Okay, what that's going to do is, obviously image scale, x scale is, for example, 1 means maximum scale and 1.5 means 150% scale, etc. So by dividing the width of the bigger object, which is crate in this case, because other from inside the width gives us back our crate, right, of like 48 sprite width, dividing that by the width of the wall, which is 32, gives us 1 point something or other, right, which ends up being the percent by which, or the factor by which x scale, by width, by which the width of the crate is bigger than the wall. And by just setting image x scale of the wall to that amount, we make the wall the correct size, okay? You have to be careful with these as well, because they update themselves, sprite width. So after doing image x scale, the sprite width of the wall object will actually become 48. That's just something to bear in mind, okay? Because it'll be 32 at the time, but then it'll become 48 after we adjust our x scale, because it takes x scale and y scale into account. Okay, if you want to ever get a value that doesn't take those into account, you want to do get sprite. What is it? It's like sprite get width or something like that. Yeah, I think that's the one. And then that gets the width of the actual sprite resource rather than sort of the current sprite width based on image x scale, y scale. Just something for you to know later on. And then the only other thing we want to do in here is add the destroy event and say with my wall instance destroy, so that when the crate dies, it'll kill the wall and we'll be able to walk through that area of space. Okay, now we'll run this, but there is going to be a slight problem with this. I don't know how evident it will be, depending on how the bullets land, but hopefully you'll see it come up pretty clearly. Okay, no, this time it's actually worked out pretty well. But there is actually a bit of an issue here that can crop up now and again, depending on how the bullets land, is because we've got a wall and a crate in the same place, and let's actually make sure that that worked as well. Because we didn't actually test what we just did and that you can walk through them. But because we've got a wall of that size in the same place, just make sure, yeah, that's working okay, and we can walk through. Cool. They're exactly the same size and exactly the same place. Our bullet has to prioritize one over the other when it lands, and so you may find sometimes, or if you hit a certain angle or just, I don't know, certain in a certain way, sometimes the wall will get hit and the bullet will destroy itself rather than the crate getting hit, and the crate won't take any damage. Because if we look in bullet, we've noticed we've actually got two different events where this kind of thing happens. Okay, we've got a collision event with P shootable, and a begin step where we do place meeting wall, image index not equals 0, instance destroy. Okay, here, weirdly enough, when we ran it then, it didn't seem to be happening. It did when I coded this to test, but it wasn't happening at all here, but that's recording for you. But we still run the risk of that happening, because it's, I don't know the event order internally in GameMaker by heart. If you did, in theory, I suppose you can make this thing work, but rather than try and rely on those ideas, let's keep complete control over how these things work in order, so that we know exactly what is going to happen when, and we prevent that kind of problem from ever happening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this chunk of code from the collision with P shootable, and I'm going to delete this event. And what we're going to do is we're going to do all the collisions for bullet in this one begin step, rather than sort of splitting them off up against multiple ones when we don't know what order that all happens in. So before we check for a collision with the wall, we're going to do, I'm going to paste this code in, and I'm going to do if place meeting x, y, p shootable, and then instead of doing with other, because obviously we're not in a collision event, that's not, oops, sorry, close that, we're not in a collision event, so there is no other, we want to do it with instance place x, y, p shootable, which will return the ID of the thing we've just collided with, okay, because it'll do that collision check again and actually get its ID. Place meeting doesn't get the ID. You could do if instance place there does not equal no one, that kind of thing might be more efficient, but this will work how we want it to, okay? So, and obviously we don't want to just destroy no matter what, so let's fold this inside that collision check as well. So your final chunk should look something like that, okay? So we check for a collision with something that's shootable first, and then destroy the bullet if that all happens. And if not, then we check for a collision with the wall. The fact that we do this second means we're never going to end up in a situation with because the crate and the wall overlap, where the wall destroys the bullet and it never gets to affect the crate. Okay, and that should be all there is to it. I'll run it again. I mean, it seemed to work fine beforehand. But here we just know that we have a bit more control over it, okay? So if I just run along, grab the gun, we can shoot these, I can jump on top of these, that's kind of neat too, and destroy those, okay? And we come into here, it says please don't murder anyone, the park ranger, okay? We've lost some of the humor in that joke by not having a bunch of people that you've killed beforehand. Maybe we'll move that aside later on, I don't know, but it still makes sense as the intro to the game for me. So we have an area with no enemies, and we're going to go through. There's no other levels at the moment, most of them got lost to that stupid bug, but we're going to make a bunch of those again later. But for now, we just go into this room. In the next couple of parts, we might look at giving the enemy some weapons so they fight back, so our game becomes a little bit less horrible and less about murdering loads of totally innocent people, and just about murdering other horrible people with guns. It's a bit better, right? So that's something we might have to look forward to. But that's sort of created us a bit more of a complete level 1. So we've got this kind of experience. We go up, you just sort of discover this gun, you can pick it up, we learn how to use it, and we shoot our way through here. We find a signpost, and that sort of, foreshadows the things to come. And we walk through this trigger area, and it'll take us to the next level of our game. So that's level 1, okay? Thanks for watching this part. Catch you guys next time on part 20 in probably a couple of weeks. And I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. A huge shout out, as always, to my Patreon supporters, without whom I couldn't do any of this awesome work. An extra special shout out in particular to Mark Lintz, Doan Techben, Dan, Zephyr Flame, James Grumley, Mark Day, Cody Hodkinson, Rovan Darlin, Harold Gidry, Valp, Matt Coate, Fisk McTaggart, Sam Stallion, Lewis R. Pereira, Nick Slabish, Stephen Hagen, Michael Ward, Jason McMillan, Vasco, Edward Lako, Jonathan, Robert Churches, Owen Morgan, Zenan May, Bowser the Dog, TJ, and Patrick Guffey. Thank you all so much for your support, and I'll catch you guys next time.